There is a silence between stars that most species never truly hear. It is not the absence of sound, for sound cannot travel through the void, but something deeper, something older. It is the silence of time itself, stretching across distances so vast that light grows tired in the crossing. In that silence, empires rise and fall like heartbeats. Civilizations bloom and wither like flowers in a garden that spans 100,000 light years. And somewhere, always, something is dying, while something else is being born.
I have listened to that silence for 412 years.
My name is Keth'vari Dominion, and I was first observer of the Keth'vari Concord, keeper of histories, witness to the long peace that my people believed would never end. I have seen 17 stellar nurseries give birth to new suns. I have walked on worlds so ancient that their mountains had worn down to whispers. I have read the final words of species that vanished before your sun learned how to burn. And I have watched everything I ever loved turn to ash and memory. The Keth'vari were old when the first single-celled organisms stirred in Earth's primordial oceans. We had charted the galaxy when humanity's ancestors still lived in trees, still looked up at the night sky with eyes that could not yet dream of what lay beyond. We built our first hyperspace gates when your species was learning to chip stones into tools. By the time humans discovered fire, we had already grown weary of conquest, weary of expansion, weary of the eternal competition that defines younger races. We chose peace. We chose wisdom. We chose to become shepherds of the galaxy rather than its masters. For 60,000 years, that choice sustained us. We mediated conflicts between rising civilizations. We preserved the knowledge of fallen ones. We watched from our orbital libraries and our crystalline cities as species after species clawed their way up from their birth worlds, reached for the stars, and either joined the great community of minds or burned themselves out in the trying. We thought we understood the galaxy. We thought we understood survival. We were wrong. The hollowing came without warning, as extinction so often does. One moment, the Concord stretched across 9,000 systems, a web of knowledge and commerce and carefully maintained harmony. The next, the outer colonies went silent. Then the middle territories. Then the core worlds began to scream. They came from somewhere beyond the galactic rim, if they came from anywhere at all. The Keth'vari, the Hollowers, entities that existed in the spaces between dimensions, that fed on consciousness itself, that could not be reasoned with because they did not think in ways that reason could touch. They did not conquer, they did not destroy, they simply consumed. World after world, mind after mind, leaving behind only empty shells, bodies that still moved, cities that still functioned, but with nothing behind the eyes. Nothing at all. In 18 months, we lost everything. 60,000 years of history, 9,000 worlds, 14 billion Keth'vari souls. Gone. Hollowed. Empty. I remember the day I stopped counting the dead. It was the day the last fleet fell at Keth'vari Prime, our homeworld, our heart, the place where my people had first looked up at their own night sky and wondered what lay beyond.
I watched the tactical displays as ship after ship winked out of existence, as the planetary shields flickered and died, as the hollowing spread across the surface like a stain that could never be cleaned.
My daughter was on HSS Prime.
Her name was Celeste. She was 207 years old, still young by our standards, still full of questions, still eager to learn, still convinced that the universe was fundamentally good and that wisdom could solve any problem. She believed in the Concord. She believed in peace. She believed that if we could only understand the Hollowers, we could find a way to coexist with them. I never told her she was wrong. I didn't have the chance.
The last message I received from her was 17 words long. Father, the sky is darkening. I can feel them at the edges of my thoughts. I love. The transmission ended there.
I have replayed those 17 words 11,432 times. I have analyzed every frequency, every harmonic, every microscopic fluctuation in the signal, searching for some hidden meaning, some final gift of understanding. There is nothing, just silence, just the void where my daughter's voice used to be.
That was 14 months ago.
Now there are fewer than 800,000 Keth'vari left alive in all the galaxy. We flee in whatever ships survived the hollowing, refugees from a civilization that once believed itself eternal. We beg for shelter from species we once patronized, once guided, once looked upon with the gentle condescension of elders watching children play. Most turn us away. They have their own borders to protect, their own populations to shelter, their own fears of the darkness that is spreading across the stars. The Keth'vari do not discriminate. They hunger for all consciousness equally. Every species knows that harboring Keth'vari refugees might draw the Hollowers' attention, might make them the next target, might condemn their own worlds to the same fate that befell ours.
I cannot blame them for their fear. I carry enough of my own.
But there was one species that did not turn us away. One species that, against all logic and self-interest, opened its borders to the ragged survivors of a once great civilization. Humanity. I confess that when our refugee convoy first set course for Earth, I felt nothing but despair and a deep, exhausted shame. The humans were so young. Their first faster-than-light ship had launched barely 3 centuries before. They had joined the galactic community as a minor power, unremarkable except for their unusual resilience and their strange, almost aggressive curiosity. The Concord had welcomed them with the same patient benevolence we extended to all young species, never imagining that one day we might need their help. They were not supposed to matter. They were not supposed to be anything more than one more entry in our endless catalogs of emerging civilizations, one more species to guide and protect and gently correct when they made the inevitable mistakes of youth. We were so certain of our own importance. We were so blind. The human border station was called Prometheus Gate. It hung in orbit around a dying red dwarf star at the edge of their territory, a functional structure of metal and composite materials utterly lacking in the aesthetic grace that the Keth'vari valued. No crystal spires, no harmonically tuned architecture, no gardens of living light, just gray corridors and efficient systems, and humans moving purposefully through spaces designed for work rather than beauty. I found it unsettling at first. Then I found it restful. There was something honest about a species that did not waste resources on appearance, that built things to function rather than to impress. After the crystalline magnificence of HSS Prime, now hollow, now empty, now nothing but a monument to pride that could not protect itself, I found human practicality almost comforting.
Almost.
The officer who processed our refugee convoy was a woman named Commander Sarah Chen. She was small by human standards, with dark hair pulled back from a face that showed the lines of age and responsibility. Her eyes were brown, an unremarkable color among her species, but they held a quality I had not expected: warmth. Genuine warmth directed at a shipload of exhausted, traumatized aliens who represented everything her species was not.
"First observer, Keth'vari Dominion," she said, reading from a datapad as I approached her station. Her pronunciation of my name was imperfect, but earnest. "I've read your file. I'm sorry for your losses, all of them."
The words were simple. Humans did not speak in the elaborate formal registers that most advanced species used for diplomatic occasions. They said what they meant, plainly, without ornamentation. I did not know how to respond.
Thank you, I managed. The human phrase felt strange in my mouth, but it was the only one that seemed appropriate. We are grateful for your willingness to receive us.
Commander Chen nodded. We've established a settlement zone in the Tau Ceti system. Temperate world, good agricultural potential. It's not much, but it's stable. You'll have time to breathe, time to plan.
You are taking a risk, I said. The Hollowers follow consciousness. Wherever we go, they may follow. She met my eyes. In that moment, I saw something I had not expected. Not fear, not bravado, but a calm, measured awareness. She knew the risk. She had accepted it deliberately. "We're aware," she said simply. I waited for more, for an explanation, a justification, some grand statement of human values or strategic calculation. None came. She simply turned back to her datapad and began processing the next stage of our intake. It was the first time I realized that humans were not what I had assumed.
Over the following weeks, I watched them carefully. It was, after all, what I was trained to do: observe, analyze, understand. The Vethrani had built their entire civilization on the foundation of knowledge, on the belief that any problem could be solved if one only understood it deeply enough. That belief had failed us against the Hollowers, but the habit remained. So I watched, and I listened, and I tried to understand the species that had, against all logic, chosen to shelter us. They were not impressive by galactic standards. Their ships were sturdy but unexceptional, their weapons adequate but not remarkable, their population significant but hardly overwhelming. 100 billion humans spread across 47 worlds and countless stations and habitats, respectable for such a young species, but nothing compared to the great powers. The Keth'vari had consumed civilizations 10 times their size without slowing. What struck me was their manner, their quietness. Most young species burned with ambition, with the need to prove themselves, to carve out their place in a galaxy that had existed for billions of years before they arrived. Humans seemed patient. They went about their work with a methodical efficiency that I found almost unnerving. They did not boast of their accomplishments or make grandiose claims about their destiny. They simply did what needed to be done and then moved on to the next task. It was 3 weeks after our arrival that I had my first real conversation with a human. Not the formal exchanges of diplomatic protocol, but an actual conversation, unscripted and unplanned. I had found a small observation lounge on the station where the stars were visible through a transparent dome. It was late by the station's arbitrary day-night cycle, and I had assumed I would be alone with my thoughts and my grief. Instead, I found a human man sitting in one of the chairs, a cup of something hot steaming in his hands, staring out at the void. He was older than Commander Chen, with gray at his temples and the weathered skin of someone who had spent time on high-radiation worlds. His uniform identified him as a captain, David Okonkwo, according to the name patch. He glanced at me as I entered but did not speak, simply nodding in acknowledgement and returning his gaze to the stars.
I should have left. I should have returned to my quarters, to the empty room that still felt like a coffin after the vast spaces of Keth'vari ships. But something made me stay. Perhaps it was the loneliness. Perhaps it was the silence between us, which felt different from the terrible silence of the void. More like companionship, the shared understanding of two beings who had seen too much.
May I join you? I asked.
He gestured to an empty chair.
Please.
I sat. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The stars wheeled slowly past the dome as the station rotated, ancient light from ancient fires reaching us across distances that made even my 4 centuries of life seem like nothing at all.
"I lost my wife," he said eventually, still not looking at me. 7 years ago. Industrial accident on a mining platform. They told me it was quick. They told me she didn't suffer. I don't know if that's true, or if they just said it to make me feel better.
I did not know what to say. Human emotional expressions were still unfamiliar to me, their grief rituals strange and abbreviated compared to the elaborate mourning ceremonies of my people.
I'm sorry, I offered.
He nodded.
I know you lost someone too. I can see it in the way you move, the way you look at things, like you're trying to memorize them before they disappear.
The observation was uncomfortably accurate. I had not realized I was so transparent.
My daughter, I said. The words came slowly, painfully, like shards of glass being extracted from a wound. She was on our homeworld when the hollowing reached it.
I'm sorry.
She believed in peace. She believed that any conflict could be resolved through understanding, through empathy, through the patient work of building bridges across differences. I felt the familiar ache in my chest, the hollow space where certainty used to be. She was wrong. Some things cannot be understood. Some things cannot be bridged.
Captain Okonkwo was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe, or maybe she was more right than you know."
I looked at him, surprised.
I'm not saying the hollowers can be reasoned with, he continued. From everything we've learned, they're about as interested in dialogue as a hurricane. But your daughter believed in something. She believed in trying to understand, even when it was hard, even when it seemed impossible. That's not weakness, that's strength.
It did not save her. No, it didn't, but it's still not weakness. He took a sip of his drink, coffee, I would later learn, a stimulant beverage that humans consumed in remarkable quantities. You know what I've noticed about your people, First Observer? You're ashamed. Not just grieving, ashamed. Like you think you failed some kind of test. Like the hollowing happened because you did something wrong.
I could not meet his eyes. We were supposed to be wise. We were supposed to understand the universe well enough to protect ourselves and others. 60,000 years of knowledge, and we couldn't stop them. We couldn't even slow them down.
And that makes you ashamed?
Doesn't it?
He shook his head slowly. No, it makes you survivors. There's no shame in losing to something bigger than you. There's only shame in giving up while you still have breath in your body.
I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to explain that he didn't understand, that the Keth'vari had been the caretakers of the galaxy, that our failure was not merely personal, but civilizational. But something in his voice stopped me. a depth of conviction that seemed too heavy for such a young species.
"How do you know that?" I asked. "You are barely 3 centuries old as an interstellar civilization. How do you know about survival?"
He smiled, though there was no humor in it. "First observer, we were surviving long before we reached the stars. Our history is a catalog of disasters, wars, plagues, famines, extinctions that came within a hair's breadth of ending us entirely. We almost destroyed ourselves with nuclear weapons. We almost cooked our planet with our own waste heat. We almost fractured into 1,000 warring factions so many times that I've lost count." He turned to face me fully, and I saw something in his eyes that I had not expected. Not pride exactly, but something harder, something forged in fire.
Every generation of humans inherits a world that the previous generation almost destroyed, and every generation finds a way to keep going anyway. Not because we're strong, not because we're wise, not because we're special, just because we're stubborn, because we refuse to lie down and die no matter how many times the universe tries to kill us.
"And you think that's enough?" I asked. "Stubbornness?"
"I think it's what we have," he said. "I think it's what everyone has in the end. The choice to keep fighting or the choice to stop. Everything else is details."
I thought about his words for a long time after that conversation. I thought about them as our refugee convoy was escorted to the settlement world, as I watched Vethrani families begin the slow, painful work of building new lives from the wreckage of the old. I thought about them as I read the reports from the front lines, the hollowing spreading, system after system falling dark, the great powers of the galaxy retreating, consolidating, preparing for sieges they were not sure they could survive. I thought about them as I realized, slowly, that Captain Okonkwo had told me something important without ever saying it directly.
Humans knew about survival because they had almost died so many times. Their history was not a triumphant march toward the stars, but a desperate scramble away from one apocalypse after another. They had fought wars that killed hundreds of millions. They had endured plagues that wiped out half their population. They had scraped and struggled and clawed their way to the stars through a minefield of self-inflicted and cosmic disasters.
And they were still here. It was 2 months after our arrival that the hollowing reached human space. I heard the news from one of the settlement administrators, a young Vethrani named Corell who had been working with human agricultural specialists. He came to my quarters with fear in his eyes and trembling in his hands, and I knew before he spoke that something terrible had happened. "First observer," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're here." The humans detected a hollowing incursion in the Kepler sector. 3 colony worlds, 17 million people. I felt the familiar cold settle into my bones, the cold of inevitability, the cold of watching the end approach and knowing there was nothing to be done. "How long?" I asked. "The incursion started 6 hours ago. The humans, they're responding." Something in his voice made me pause. "Responding how?"
I don't know, but they're not evacuating. They're not retreating. They're sending ships toward the incursion, not away from it.
I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. That's suicide. No one attacks a hollowing incursion. The Keth'vari cannot be fought. We learned that the hardest way possible. Anyone who enters an active hollowing zone is simply added to it.
"I know," Coral said, "but the humans don't seem to agree."
I went to the settlement's communications center, a hastily constructed building filled with equipment that the humans had provided. The staff there,
A mixture of Keth'vari refugees and human technicians were clustered around the main display, watching feeds from the Kepler sector with expressions of horrified fascination.
Commander Chen was there. She noticed my arrival and waved me over.
First observer, I was going to send for you. We thought you might want to see this.
See what? I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to know.
Something new.
She pointed to the display. I looked, and I felt my certainties begin to crack. The tactical feed showed the Kepler sector, 3 human colony worlds arranged in a rough triangle, connected by shipping lanes and communication relays. The hollowing signature was visible as a spreading darkness at the edge of the display, that familiar pattern of consciousness death that I had seen so many times before. But something was different. Between the hollowing and the colonies, a fleet was forming. Human warships, dozens of them, arranged in a formation I did not recognize. They were not fleeing. They were not positioning for a desperate last stand. They were waiting. Calm. Ordered.
What are they doing? I asked.
Commander Chen's expression was unreadable. Watch. The hollowing advanced. I had seen this so many times. That terrible tide of emptiness, that wave of unbeing that swept away everything in its path. It had consumed Keth'vari fleets 10 times this size. It had broken through defenses that my people had spent centuries perfecting. The human fleet held position. Then one ship moved forward. A single vessel, larger than the others, its hull marked with symbols I did not recognize. It positioned itself directly in the path of the hollowing. "What is that ship?" I asked. "What is it doing?"
That's the UES Thermopylae, Commander Chen said. Heavy dreadnought. Admiral James Whitmore commanding.
One ship cannot stop a hollowing incursion. One ship cannot.
Just watch.
The Thermopylae's weapon systems activated. I saw the power readings spike on the tactical display, but they were wrong. They were impossibly wrong. The energy signatures were 10 times what a ship that size should have been able to generate, 100 times.
And then the ship spoke. I do not have words for what happened next. The Keth'vari language, for all its precision and nuance, lacks the vocabulary to describe what I witnessed. The Thermopylae released something, not a weapon in any conventional sense, but a pulse of energy that seemed to resonate on frequencies I had never detected before, frequencies that existed outside normal space, frequencies that touched whatever dimension the Keth'vari called home.
The hollowing. For the first time in 18 months of relentless advance, for the first time since the extinction of the Keth'vari Concord, the darkness stopped spreading.
And then it began to retreat.
I watched, unable to breathe, as the hollowing pulled back from the Kepler sector. Not quickly. The retreat was measured, almost reluctant, but unmistakably. The darkness was withdrawing. The Keth'vari were leaving.
How? I managed to say. How is this possible?
Commander Chen looked at me with those calm brown eyes. We've been working on it for a while.
Working on it? Working on what? A weapon that can affect the Keth'vari? A defense that can push back the hollowing? We tried everything. Every technology we had, every theory we developed, everything we learned in 60,000 years of accumulated knowledge. Nothing worked. Nothing touched them.
I know. Then how? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "First observer, how much do you know about human history?" The question seemed absurd given what I had just witnessed. I know the basics. You developed on a high-gravity world with an unusually active sun. You achieved industrial technology through combustion and electricity.
You reached space through chemical propulsion. You joined the galactic community 300 years ago as a minor power.
That's the summary, the clean version. Did you ever study what happened before we reached the stars?
Not in detail. Pre-spaceflight history of emerging species is not typically considered relevant to
the important matters of the galaxy. I understand. We were beneath your notice. There was no bitterness in her voice, just a simple statement of fact. Let me tell you a little about what you missed.
She began to talk, and I began to understand.
Humans, she explained, had spent most of their history at war. Not the civilized conflicts of advanced species with their rules and limitations and carefully managed escalations. Human wars were brutal, total, apocalyptic. They had invented weapons specifically designed to kill as many of their own kind as possible. Chemical agents that dissolved lungs, biological weapons that spread plague, nuclear devices that could vaporize cities.
They had used these weapons on themselves. They had come within moments of destroying their entire civilization multiple times. They had built arsenals capable of rendering their planet uninhabitable and had kept those arsenals pointed at each other for decades, living under the constant shadow of annihilation. And through it all, they had learned.
We learned how to think about unthinkable threats, Commander Chen said. We learned how to plan for scenarios where normal rules don't apply. We learned how to keep working, keep building, keep preparing, even when the odds seem impossible. Especially when the odds seem impossible.
But the Keth'vari, we started studying them the moment we detected the first incursion in Vethrani space. Your people thought we were too primitive to contribute, too young to understand. You never shared your research with us. You never asked for our help. You were so certain that your wisdom was enough.
I felt the truth of her words like a blade. She was right. We had dismissed the humans. We had dismissed everyone who was not Vethrani, certain that only our ancient wisdom could solve the problem of the hollowing. And in our arrogance, we had died.
We didn't have your knowledge, Commander Chen continued. We didn't have your experience. But we had something else. We had practice at being afraid. Practice at facing extinction. Practice at building things in the dark, not knowing if they would work, not knowing if we would survive long enough to use them.
The weapon, the technology on the Thermopylae.
It's not a weapon, not exactly. It's a communication, a signal that the Keth'vari can perceive, a message in their own frequency.
A message? What message?
She smiled, and there was something fierce in it, something old and deep and terrible. The same message we've been sending to the universe since we first looked up at the stars. The message that says, we are here. We will not go quietly. We will fight you with everything we have, and if you destroy us, we will make sure you remember us forever.
I stared at her. That cannot work. The Keth'vari are not sentient in any way we understand. They cannot be intimidated. They cannot be threatened.
They can't be intimidated by normal threats. They exist beyond normal space. They feed on consciousness, on the organized patterns of thinking beings. They're not afraid of physical destruction, because physical weapons can't touch them.
We figured out where they lived. We figured out how to reach them there, and we built something that can hurt them in their own dimension. Not kill them. We don't think they can be killed, not really. But hurt them. Make them feel something like pain. Make them understand that feeding on us has a cost.
I sat down heavily. My legs would not support me.
You built a weapon that can hurt extra-dimensional entities? In 300 years? When we couldn't do it in 60,000?
You weren't trying to build a weapon.
You were trying to understand them, to find a peaceful solution. She sat down next to me. That's not a criticism, First Observer. Your daughter was right. Understanding is better than violence, always. But sometimes violence is necessary to create the space where understanding can happen.
I don't. I shook my head, trying to process what I was hearing. I don't understand how this is possible. Your technology is not more advanced than ours. Your science is not deeper. How could you solve a problem that we couldn't even approach? Commander Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, First Observer, can I ask you something personal?
Yes. Your people lived in peace for 60,000 years. You resolved conflicts through diplomacy. You built your civilization on wisdom and knowledge and the patient accumulation of understanding. In all that time, how many truly existential threats did you face? I thought about the question. Really thought about it, reaching back through centuries of historical knowledge.
None, I admitted.
There were conflicts, challenges, problems to be solved, but nothing that threatened the existence of our species, nothing that could have ended us. We've faced at least a dozen that I can think of off the top of my head, and those are just the ones we survived. Countless more civilizations rose on Earth before us and were wiped out by climate change, disease, meteor impacts. Our planet has experienced 5 major mass extinction events. 5 times almost everything died. I know your planet's history. Then you know that we evolved in a crucible. Everything about us, our minds, our bodies, our instincts, was shaped by constant existential pressure. We don't just intellectually understand that the universe is trying to kill us. We feel it in our bones, in every cell. It's been bred into us over hundreds of millions of years. She leaned forward. When you faced the Keth'vari, you looked for solutions within the framework of your experience. Wisdom, understanding, diplomacy. When we faced them, we looked for solutions within the framework of ours. Survival at any cost. Survival, period. Not at any cost, we're not monsters. But survival as the foundation, the baseline, the thing that everything else gets built on. You thought about how to live with the Keth'vari. We thought about how to make the Keth'vari let us live. It was such a small distinction, such a tiny shift in perspective, and yet it had led to an outcome that 60,000 years of Vethrani wisdom had not achieved. I thought about Seleth, about her belief in peace, in understanding, in the power of empathy to bridge any gap. She had died holding those beliefs, and I had thought her naive. Perhaps she had not been naive. Perhaps she had simply been applying the right principles in the wrong order. Perhaps understanding had to come after survival, not before. What happens now? I asked. Commander Chen stood up and looked at the tactical display, where the hollowing signature was still receding from human space. Now we push back. The following months were unlike anything I had experienced in 400 years of life. I watched as humanity mobilized in a way that defied everything I thought I knew about young species. There was no panic, no chaos, no scrambling for resources or bitter arguments about strategy. The human governments, dozens of them, each with its own traditions and priorities, simply aligned. Factories that had been producing consumer goods retooled for war production. Research institutions that had been pursuing commercial technologies pivoted to defense applications. Billions of civilians volunteered for service, not because they were conscripted, but because they understood on some level deeper than policy or propaganda that this was a fight for everything. I asked Captain Okonkwo about it once.
during one of our quiet conversations in the observation lounge. How did humanity coordinate so effectively? Where was the infighting, the political maneuvering, the inevitable friction of competing interests?
He laughed, a tired, knowing sound. Oh, it's there. Trust me, we're arguing about everything. Who gets credit for what, how resources should be allocated, which strategies to prioritize. It's ugly as hell behind closed doors.
But you're still coordinating. You're still functioning. Because we agree on one thing. We don't want to die. And when humans agree on something that fundamental, we can put up with a lot of bullshit from each other while we work toward it.
Is it really that simple?
He shrugged. Simple doesn't mean easy, but yeah, it's that simple. We've had a lot of practice at setting aside differences when something bigger threatens all of us. It never lasts. We always go back to fighting each other eventually. But for right now, in this moment, we're pointed in the same direction. I watched the human fleet grow. Ship after ship emerged from construction yards, each one equipped with the new technology, the resonance, they called it, the signal that could touch the Keth'vari in their own dimension. Within 6 months, they had 500 vessels capable of projecting resonance. Within a year, 2,000. And they were not merely defending. The first human offensive into hollowed space began 17 months after the initial incursion into the Kepler sector. I watched the feeds from the command center of the settlement world, surrounded by Vethrani refugees who still could not quite believe what they were seeing. The fleet was led by the Thermopylae, now joined by its sister ships, the Marathon, the Stalingrad, the Kursk, the Rorke's Drift. Each name, I would later learn, commemorated a human battle where a smaller force had stood against overwhelming odds. It was, I realized, a statement, a declaration of intent encoded in the very names they gave their weapons.
We will not yield. We have never yielded. We will hold this line until the stars burn out.
The hollowed territory they entered had once been part of the Vethrani Concord. Worlds I knew, worlds I had visited, worlds that were now empty, their populations consumed, their cities quiet monuments to the dead.
The Keth'vari responded. For the first time since the hollowing began, they turned their attention to something other than expansion. The human fleet encountered resistance, waves of that dimensional pressure that had annihilated Vethrani ships like insects against a windshield.
The humans did not break. They projected the resonance, and the Keth'vari recoiled. They advanced into spaces that no other species had entered and survived. They pushed and pushed and pushed.
It was not easy. The feeds showed ships being lost. Human vessels caught by the hollowing before they could activate their resonance projectors, crews of hundreds or thousands simply gone. The humans paid a price for every light year they reclaimed. They paid it without hesitation.
I asked Commander Chen about this once, about the losses, about how humanity could sustain such a cost.
Every soldier who dies out there knows what they're fighting for, she said. They're not dying to conquer territory or prove a point. They're dying so that everyone else can live. That's a trade we've always been willing to make.
It seems cruel to ask so much of individuals. It is cruel. War is cruel, but the alternative is extinction, and extinction is crueler.
The human advance continued. Hollowed systems were reclaimed. Worlds that had been silent for months began to show signs of recovery. The resonance, it seemed, did not just repel the Keth'vari, but undid some of what they had done. Consciousness returned to places where it had been erased. Not the original consciousness, the dead were still dead, but new life began to emerge. Seeds that had been dormant started to grow.
Microorganisms that had survived the hollowing in deep caves or ocean trenches began to multiply. It would take centuries for those worlds to recover fully, millennia perhaps, but they would recover. The hollowing was not permanent.
That discovery spread through the refugee populations like wildfire. For the first time since the fall of the Concord, Keth'vari allowed themselves to hope. Perhaps our worlds could be reclaimed. Perhaps some trace of what we had lost could be restored.
I did not share their optimism. I had seen too much. I knew that even if Vetherus Prime was freed from the hollowing, Seleth would not be there. My daughter was gone, and no military victory could bring her back. But I watched, I observed, and slowly I began to understand something that I had not expected. The humans were not fighting for territory or resources or power. They were not even fighting for their own survival, though that was certainly part of it. They were fighting for something larger, something that I, in my Keth'vari certainty about the nature of the universe, had never fully grasped.
They were fighting for the idea that consciousness itself was worth preserving, that the universe was better with minds in it than without, that the strange, stubborn, irrational persistence of thinking beings was, in itself, a kind of victory against the cold entropy of existence. It was, in a way, the same thing Seleth had believed, the same principle that had guided the Keth'vari Concord for 60,000 years. But the humans expressed it differently, not through wisdom and patience and the careful cultivation of understanding, but through defiance, through the simple animal refusal to accept annihilation.
I had thought these approaches were opposites. I had thought humanity's violent history made them fundamentally different from the Keth'vari, fundamentally less evolved.
I was beginning to realize that they were different paths to the same destination.
The liberation of Vetherus Prime took 3 days.
I watched from the bridge of the Thermopylae. Admiral Whitmore had extended an invitation to first observer status, a gesture of respect that I had not expected. Around me, human officers worked their stations with that same calm efficiency I had observed since my first arrival at Prometheus Gate. No urgency, no panic, just the steady execution of plans laid months in advance.
The Keth'vari fought harder here than anywhere else. Perhaps they sensed the significance of this world. Perhaps they had invested more of themselves in the hollowing of our homeworld, consumed more consciousness, established deeper roots in this reality. It did not matter. The resonance pushed them back, wave after wave of that strange, singing energy that existed between dimensions, the human answer to an alien threat that had seemed unanswerable. The darkness retreated from Vetherus Prime's skies. The emptiness withdrew from its cities. I wept as I watched my homeworld return from death.
Keth'vari do not weep as humans do. Our grief takes different physiological forms, but the meaning was the same. The world where I was born, where Seleth was born, where 60,000 years of history had unfolded, it was still there. Changed, damaged, empty of the people who had loved it, but there.
Admiral Whitmore noticed my reaction. He was an older man, gray-haired and stern, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades making impossible decisions and living with the consequences. He had lost ships today, lost crews, lost people whose names he knew and whose families would grieve for them.
"First observer," he said quietly, "would you like to say something? A message to your people? This is your world."
I looked at the tactical display, at the receding, hollowing signature, at the world that was slowly coming back to life.
I don't know what to say.
Then don't say anything. Just witness.
That's what your title means, doesn't it? First observer?
Yes. Then observe. Remember this. Tell the story to anyone who will listen. That's how things survive, through the people who remember them. I observed, I remembered, and I began to understand what humanity had given us. Not just the liberation of our world, but a different way of thinking about survival and loss and the meaning of endurance. The Vethrani had tried to transcend the universe's cruelty through wisdom. We had built our civilization on the belief that knowledge could shield us from anything, that understanding was the ultimate defense. When the hollowing came, we had no framework for responding to a threat that could not be understood. Humanity had embraced the universe's cruelty. They had lived with it, fought it, been shaped by it. They did not believe they could transcend existence's violence. They believed they could endure it, and in that endurance, they had found a strength that transcended wisdom.
The war against the Keth'vari continued for another 7 years.
It was not a simple victory. The Hollowers adapted, found new strategies, learned to resist the resonance in limited ways. Humanity adapted in turn, developed new frequencies, new technologies, new approaches. It was an arms race conducted across dimensions, a conflict of ideas as much as weapons. But the tide never turned back. The Keth'vari retreated, slowly but consistently, pushed back toward whatever void they had emerged from. System by system, the galaxy was reclaimed. Worlds that had been hollowed began to heal. New civilizations emerged from hiding, emboldened by humanity's example. The Vethrani returned to Vethris Prime, not to rebuild what we had lost. That was impossible, but to build something new, something different, something that incorporated the lessons of our fall and our rescue. I was 419 years old when I stood again on the soil of my homeworld. The crystal spires were gone, shattered by the hollowing, and cleared away by the first waves of reconstruction. In their place, new structures were rising, simpler, more practical, more human in their aesthetic. We had learned. We had changed. We would never again believe that wisdom alone was sufficient. There is a memorial on Vethris Prime now, in the place where the great library of the Concord once stood. It lists the names of every Vethrani who died in the hollowing, 14 billion names, etched into crystalline surfaces that catch the light and scatter it like tears.
Seleth's name is there, on a panel near the center. I visit it sometimes when the weight of memory grows too heavy. I stand before those 17 letters, her name spelled in our ancient script, and I remember her last words. Father, the sky is darkening. I can feel them at the edges of my thoughts. I know now how that sentence would have ended. I always knew, really. But there is a difference between knowing and having heard, between inference and memory. That incomplete sentence will haunt me for the rest of my life. I visit that section too. I read the names, strange syllables in a language that is not mine, belonging to people I never knew. And I feel something that I would not have expected back when I first arrived at Prometheus Gate as a broken refugee from a fallen civilization. I feel gratitude. Deep, abiding, transformative gratitude. The galaxy declared Earth defenseless once. I was there for that declaration, one of the Vethrani observers who reviewed the data on this young species and concluded that they were unremarkable, their technology adequate, their future limited. We noted their violent history and saw it as a weakness. We observed their stubborn survival instinct and dismissed it as primitive. We were so certain in our wisdom.
so convinced that age was equivalent to understanding. Then the hollowing came, and our wisdom failed us. Our knowledge could not protect us. Our 60,000 years of accumulated experience meant nothing against a threat that existed outside our categories. And when everything we had built was ashes, when the survivors of our great civilization huddled in refugee camps and begged for shelter, one human warship spoke. It spoke in a language that the Keth'vari could understand. It spoke with a voice forged in 1 billion years of extinction-level struggle, tempered by ice ages and asteroid impacts, and the slow, grinding pressure of a universe that had tried to kill them since the first cell divided in Earth's primordial oceans. It spoke, and the hollowing stopped. I understand now what I did not understand then. The galaxy was wrong about Earth, not because humans were stronger than they appeared, though they were, not because their technology was more advanced than we realized, though it was, but because we measured them by the wrong standard. We measured them by peace, by stability, by the absence of conflict and the accumulation of knowledge. By those metrics, they were children, barely out of their planetary nursery, still marked by the violence of their emergence. We should have measured them by survival, by the simple, stubborn fact that they were still here after everything the universe had thrown at them, by the depth of their scars and the lessons those scars had taught. Humanity was never defenseless. They had been fighting for their existence since before they were human. The galaxy saw a young species and assumed inexperience. What we should have seen was a species forged in the hottest fires, tempered by pressures that would have broken any of us. I am 423 years old now. I have lived long enough to see the galaxy begin to recover from the hollowing, long enough to see new civilizations emerge, old ones rebuild, and humanity take its place among the elder races, not through the slow accumulation of time, but through the undeniable demonstration of their nature. They are not like us. They are not patient or wise or serene. They argue with each other constantly. They make mistakes that we would never make. They burn bright and hot, expending themselves with an urgency that Vethrani find exhausting to observe. But they are here. They survived. And when the darkness came for all of us, they were the ones who found a way to push it back. I think about Seleth often. I wonder what she would make of this new galaxy, this strange alliance between species that once dismissed each other. I wonder if she would see it as a vindication of her beliefs, that understanding and empathy could bridge any gap, or as a refutation, proof that violence was sometimes necessary. I think she would see it as both. I think she would understand, as I have come to understand, that these are not opposing principles, but complementary ones, that survival creates the space for understanding, and understanding gives meaning to survival. The humans taught us that. Not with words, they are not a species given to grand philosophical statements, but with actions, with the simple daily demonstration of what it means to keep going when everything says you should stop. There is a human phrase that I have learned to love. They say it when things are difficult, when the odds seem impossible, when the universe is pressing down on them with all its weight. Not today. Not today will we surrender. Not today will we break. Not today will we go quietly into that darkness that waits for all things. Perhaps tomorrow, perhaps someday, but not today. The Vethrani never had a phrase like that. We never needed one. We believed that wisdom could prevent any tomorrow from being that day. We were wrong. The humans knew better. They knew that some days would be harder than others. They knew that the universe would keep trying to kill them. They knew that survival was not a destination, but a process, not an achievement, but a choice made over and over again in the face of everything that wanted to end them.
They knew because they had always known, because they had never been allowed to forget. I stand sometimes on the observation deck of the rebuilt Keth'vari Science Station above Vetharus Prime and look out at the stars. The same stars I have watched for 400 years. The same ancient light from ancient fires, traveling across distances that make even my long life seem like nothing. But I see them differently now. I see them as humans see them, not as objects of study or aesthetic appreciation, but as challenges, as distances to be crossed, as fires to be matched.
The universe is vast and cold and uncaring. It will kill you if it can. It will kill everything eventually. Every star will burn out. Every world will grow cold. Every consciousness will fade into the endless silence.
But not today.
Today we are here. Today we think and feel and love and remember. Today we look up at the darkness and we say no. We refuse. We will not go quietly.
That is what humanity taught us. Not how to build weapons or project resonance or fight extra-dimensional horrors. Those are just techniques, just applications of a deeper truth.
They taught us how to refuse, how to stand in the face of annihilation and say simply, no. The galaxy declared Earth defenseless once. The galaxy was wrong.
And somewhere out there in the void between stars, the Keth'vari remember what they learned when one human warship spoke. They remember the resonance that reached into their dimension and made them feel something they had never felt before.